Hey guys, welcome back to our channel. I am Sherianne and
I'm Brian.
we are Rowena Francis.
Spurs.
It's the first time we did that pretty seamlessly.
I think so.
Cool. Well, today we are getting back into the supernatural again. And Brian, why don't you give us a recap from our last supernatural video?
The last supernatural video that we did, we talked about, primarily we talked about the floods. We talked about how when we get into the supernatural realm, there was this gap that took place between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, where it said that God created the heavens and the earth, and then all of a sudden they were a wasteland, they were void, they were, full of chaos and ruin. And so we talked about that there was two floods that took place. There was the flood of Noah, and there was also this other flood that destroyed the first creation. And so what was so interesting about it is that there was a distinction that was there, and it talked about how the earth was previously, it was populated. And so really what we want to know is what happened in this first creation or this first flood, right? That caused this judgment of God to take place. And really the answer is found. It was sin.
That's right.
I mean, sin is what came into being, and as a result of sin, judgment came into the earth. And now we want to find out what was God judging and what took place during that period of time. And that's what we're going to get into today.
That's right. So we are going to start in Isaiah. We're going to turn to Isaiah 14, verse 12 to 15.
Isaiah.
I'm going to read from the King James Version because I like my Dake's Bible.
Something about the good old King James Version.
I'm a King James Version Bible reader at heart.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it's a shout out to Pastor Dave, right? He's the guy who just lives and dies by the King James Version.
Yes, I'm with you. All right, so let's pick up in verse 12. It says, "How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations?
Did weaken them.
For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars of God. I will sit also upon the mount of the congregation in the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, I will be like the Most High. Yet thou shalt be brought down to hell, to the sides of the pit."
Whoa, that's a pretty good start, I would say. So let's start off with Lucifer.
What does Lucifer mean? Do you know what the name Lucifer means?
Well, Lucifer means light bearer. It's a pretty interesting name.
That is interesting.
Which is, by the way, a little bit interesting than, that little red guy, who sits on your shoulder.
You see in cartoons and
Yeah,
it's like the devil's on one side, the angel's on the other side.
Yeah, it's like baby, and he's like talking into your ear, and he's like blah 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 blah, and he's got like these little horns on, and he's got this red. He's red and got this tail and whatnot. And so here we actually realize that when we talk about Lucifer, it says that his name actually means light bearer.
Light bearer, yeah.
And he goes by some other names too, by the way.
Yeah.
Yes, he goes by dragon.
The devil.
Goes by the devil. He goes by Satan.
Yeah.
He goes by the serpent. These are all representations of that evil guy, that dude called Lucifer.
That's right. So I wonder, let's get into how Lucifer kind of transformed from that bright shining star to the devil that we know today.
All right. Well, why don't we start in Revelation? I'm going to read a verse out of Revelations 12:4, and it says, "And his tail drew the third part of the stars of heaven, and he did cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, which was ready to be delivered, for to devour her child as soon as it was born."
You know that stars are generally representation of angels?
Yes, I do believe that.
Yeah.
So it talks in this particular case, it talked about how, a third of the stars of heaven ended up, being caught up, in this situation that was going on with Lucifer, which we don't really know what that situation is as of yet, but it is something that it talked about. It also talks about in Revelations 12:7-9, it talks about, "And there was a war in heaven." A war. Could you imagine that? In heaven. And it says, "And Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels." So here we talked about in the first verse in Revelation, we talked about the third of the stars that were swept away. And so there was this rebellion that was going on in heaven, and Michael, who is, the chief warring angel, the archangel, which we're going to talk about at a later point, he was in this war with the devil, the serpent, right? And he had a third of the angels who were fighting by his side, the devil. And it says, and he prevailed not, neither was their place found any more in heaven. And the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan. Look at that. All four names are all right represented there in one verse. And which deceiveth the whole world. And he was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him.
Yeah. So
this is a pretty good representation of, some of the things that took place, right here in the beginning. And it talked about, how there's this war in heaven, there's this rebellion that took place, and Lucifer was involved with it. And in this rebellion, there was, Lucifer and, a third of the angels of heaven fighting against Michael, right? And the other angels, which would be the other 2/3, right? So this war is going on in the heavenlies. That was a pretty dramatic event, I would imagine, that took place.
I would think so, which I think is so mind-boggling just to think of anyways in the beginning. It's just, if Lucifer was in charge of bringing all the worship up to God, and he was in charge of, here on the earth, maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead, but...
you probably are.
But what would cause him to end up in a war against God?
Well, I think some of the things that are really interesting what it says when you read in these verses. It talked about how, first of all, he says that I will ascend. He said in my heart, he said, I will ascend into heaven and I will exalt my throne right into the mount of the congregation, right?
Which is interesting because the first thing that you said, I will ascend up into heaven, which actually reveals that he was below the heavens.
He was below the heavens, right? So he was here. What's below the heavens? Earth is below the heavens. And what's interesting is it says that he had a throne. So he had a throne here on earth.
Yeah.
And he wanted to take his throne and he wanted to ascend it to heavens where God's throne was.
Yep.
So it was interesting. And it says here, so if he had a throne, that means that he had to be ruling and reigning over something that was here on earth, which is pretty interesting details. And then it says, right, it says that he weakened the nations, okay? So it means that there was nations that were here in this first creation that Lucifer was ruling and reigning over. So this gives you a different representation. So remember, when we read last week, we talked about the second flood and the first flood. And it talked about in the book of Jeremiah, and he was looking at the state of the earth from the first destruction, and it was in chaos, and it was talking about, it alluded as well to the fact that there was nations and there were cities here that were now destroyed due to this first particular rebellion that took place with Lucifer.
Yeah.
So this is a pretty interesting state, and all of this has taken place before we even get into Genesis 1-2, which talks about, the second creation. So there was a lot that was going on. So anyway, so what happens, right, is he says, I want to take my throne and I want to ascend it to God's throne, and he wants to sit where God's sitting. And, this is just not a good scenario. And it says that a war took place as a result. But I want to ask you this question. This guy must have been pretty darn, bold, but just he had to have something about him, by the way, that a third of the angelic hosts, right, would have rebelled against God.
Yeah, how do you get a third of the angels to rebel against God, where they all worshipped God, they all knew God personally, which that baffles my mind. But I want to read actually in Ezekiel 28.
All right, we're going to read further in Ezekiel 28.
And this passage is actually talking about Lucifer. So I'm going to start in verse 11. It says, Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, take up a lamentation for the king of Tyre, and say to him, Thus says the Lord God, you were the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty.
Okay, so it says here, it talks about the king of Tyre. Okay, so are they really talking about the king of Tyre? Because it talks about this person was a seal of perfection.
Yeah.
Okay, and it talks about, how, you're created basically in perfection. That's a pretty cool thing.
That is kind of cool. And so I'm going to actually pick up and show you. In verse 13 it says, You were in Eden, the garden of God.
The garden of God. Who was in Eden? Was the king of Tyre in Eden? We have no knowledge that the king of Tyre was in Eden. But we do know who was in Eden. Lucifer. Right? Lucifer.
Dun dun dun.
The snake, the serpent. He was in Eden. Right? He was the one, he was having that great conversation, with Eve. Right? So, anyway, so
let me continue.
This is talking about Lucifer here.
It is. And so it says, you were in Eden, the garden of God. It says, every precious stone was your covering. And then it goes on to say, the sardius, topaz, and diamond, beryl, onyx, and jasper, sapphire, turquoise, and emerald with gold.
Okay.
The workmanship of your timbrels and pipes was prepared for you on the day that you were created.
Okay, so there's two things that I really think are pretty cool about this. So it says, first of all, that his covering, which means that, his skin, the way that he was adorned, was with every precious stone.
Yeah, could you just imagine I think women today, they like their jewels and their jewelry and whatever, but he was adorned with these jewels.
Yes.
His body was made with these jewels.
Yeah, a little bit different than the image of this, red, a little creepy dude, the devil on your shoulder. This guy, he was a light bearer. That's what his name actually, had meant. And it talks about how beautiful that he was.
And when it says here, the workmanship of your timbrels and pipes was prepared for you on the day that you were created. So Lucifer was created with music on the inside of him. It says that the musical instruments were actually formed right into his body.
Yeah.
And so we can see that this is how God was putting him over worship and had him leading worship. He had these instruments just designed right into his body, which ironically,
who else has that?
We do.
We do. So here's another really a little tidbit thing for you. Lucifer was originally created to lead worship, right? And that was part of what his responsibilities obviously were. So when he was ruling and reigning, on this throne of earth, it was leading the worship to God.
He was.
So at some point, it says that he rebelled here, and we can talk about that in a second. But through that rebellion, he was cast out of heaven, and a second creation took place. And you know who was created in that second creation? Us.
We were.
And we were created to worship God.
That's right.
And you know who else has instruments built right into their body?
We do.
We got windpipes.
We get to talk. We get to sing.
We got vocal cords.
We have, and even if you, I think I don't even know where I heard this or whatever, but they were saying if you listen to the sound of your body, that it's like a symphony. If everything is flowing together, your body actually is like a symphony. And so we get to worship God, and we have the choice to be able to offer up our praises to God on our own will, which is pretty amazing.
But so let's keep reading on this here passage.
Yeah, so I'm going to say verse 14. You are the anointed cherub who covers. I established you. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked back and forth in the midst of fiery stones. You were perfect in your ways from the day you were created, till iniquity was found in you.
Let's stop there for 1 second. So a couple of things that was interesting here is it says, first of all, it says you were perfect in all your ways. You walked amongst the fiery stones in heaven, which were around the throne of God. Which one thing that's really cool about that is it talks about that God's glory is so bright and he's so radiant and he's so, don't forget, he's the light of the world, that the stones literally around his throne are on fire from the glory and the presence and the brightness of God himself. And there's such a holy representation of God in them. And Satan, right, Lucifer, was in that midst, that close inner circle that he literally was able to walk around in the fiery stones around God's throne.
And that's the thing. He knew who God was. He knew who God was, but something happened on the inside of him that caused him to believe that he could elevate himself above God.
Yes, and it says that he was the anointed cherub, which we'll talk about later what a cherub is.
So it says in verse 16, by the abundance of your trading, you became filled with violence within, and you sinned. This is the verse I think that just
it's a transitional verse.
It's that transitional verse because it says, it's talking about how perfect he was, how he was created, and what he was created for. And then it says that you did your job so well that you basically became filled with violence. So can you imagine, this is like somebody doing, their trade, whatever they do it so well, they have so much charisma, they have so much that they all of a sudden begin to get into the thought process that this is all me. This is everything to do with me. And this little thing called pride just kind of just seeps in there, and it makes them think that what is happening is a result of their hand in whatever it is.
Yeah. So his trade was worship.
His trade was worship, and he was worshiping and bringing the worship so beautifully to God that he began to get to the point where he was thinking, wait, this is all me. This is me. Wait a second. If they're worshiping, he says, well, I could take some of this for myself,
Yeah, so what he was doing is he was skimming some off of the top, right? So he was, leading the praise and the worship to God, which God, all of the worship is and glory is due to God and God alone.
That's right.
And so in the process of leading it, he realized and he started to think about his part in that process and his part of what he was created to do. And he started to take a little bit off of the top of what was going to God, and he started to take a little bit of that for himself. And at the end of it, it ended up lifting him up in pride, right? And as he lifted himself up in pride, this ultimately led to his demise and his rebellion.
That's right. And this is why in the Bible it says that pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall.
Yeah.
And this is what that's describing, is that, when you begin to do something and you're doing it so well, if you stop giving God the glory for that, if you stop bringing that to God and you start thinking on like, this is all what I'm doing. It's whatever, I'm putting my hand into, and you're kind of bringing that glory to yourself. You might not be taking all the glory, but you might just be taking a little bit of it.
You're on the path of Lucifer.
That little bit is a little bit too much, and so you want to be very careful. Don't let yourself fall into the trap of pride.
And if anybody had a big fall from heaven down to the earth, it was certainly Lucifer.
It says, I saw Satan fall like lightning.
That's right.
From heaven.
It says in Luke 10:18, that's actually one of the verses. I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. That was a word that was spoken by Jesus because he was there when all this took place.
That's right.
And he says he saw him fall, and man, that must have been a glorious, sight, right?
Yeah.
So finish reading this.
Yeah, let me finish. It says, therefore I cast you as a profane thing out of the mountain of God, a profane thing.
Profane.
And I destroyed you, O covering cherub, from the midst of the fiery stones. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom for the sake of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I laid you before kings, that they might gaze at you. You defiled your sanctuaries by the multitude of your iniquities, by the iniquity of your trading. Therefore I brought fire from your midst. It devoured you, and I turned you to ashes upon the earth in the sight of all who saw you.
Yes.
And I think this is the depiction of how we get from like that bright and shining star that Lucifer was to Satan, the image of Satan, the one that we know of today is, it's not a beautiful sight. He's not some beautiful shining star right now. And it's because pride entered in and it defiled him.
Yes. And so anyways, this was the beginning, right, of the end for Lucifer, right? So he ends up going through this rebellious process. He rebels against God. He thinks that he can take on God himself, right? And, it's an interesting, scenario. We're going to get into this a little bit more, but you got to remember here, right, that an angel, Lucifer was created. It says in this process that he was created, which means that he's not an equal with God. He's a created being by God. So he's not equally as evil as God is good. There's not this yin and yang process here. It is strictly God is God, and he is so significantly more powerful and righteous and holy that any evil, right, he can't compete with God. This is not an equilibrium of good versus evil.
That's right. And this is the thing. The enemy wants you to believe that evil can overtake good, or good has a hard time overtaking evil. And that's not even the case. When Jesus died on the cross, he conquered death, hell, and the grave, which means that we're victorious over sin. We're victorious over the devil. But as long as we are here on the earth, the devil has an opportunity to speak things into our minds to get us to believe things that aren't true. And that's his sole purpose, is to get you to believe that you can't overtake the enemy, that you shouldn't worship God, that you should everything that you're doing is because of what you've put into it. And if you begin to latch on to those lies, then the enemy has that hook in you. But the thing is that if you know the power of God, you know that God, he overcomes evil. He overcomes the enemy. And so we are victorious in Jesus Christ regardless because we are children of God.
Yes. So that there is the beginning of our introduction on, like 3 or 4 weeks in now on the supernatural, because now we're getting into, okay, so now we got some angelic beings. We got Lucifer, the introduction of him. And so he was created during this gap, right, between Genesis 1 and Genesis 1-2. And not only was he created during this period with other angelic beings, but also there was this whole world, there was this whole system that was in place, there was worship that was going on, there was rebellion that was going on, and all of this took place before we even got here onto this planet. And so nonetheless, we're going to continue to develop this. We're going to talk a little bit more about other types of angels and demons, and we're going to continue to talk about how they function and what their purposes are as we continue to move forward. So we look forward to sharing that information with you as we go through this series on the supernatural.